The Analogue Nt Mini released in early 2017 and established Analogue as a dominant player in the FPGA gaming market. Thanks to lead engineer Kevin Keptris Horton, it offered the ability to play NES and Famicom cartridges in up to 1080p on your HD TV, or high-quality analog output on a CRT. Once out of production, the consoles began to fetch extraordinarily high prices on eBay, not only due to the quality of its official functionality, but also because ROM loading and additional platforms, such as the Atari 2600, Sega Master System, and Game Boy were added via a so-called jailbroken firmware branch. In early 2020, Analogue announced the Nt Mini Noir, a gunmetal black edition that would be available for one final run at a premium price of $500. It was do or die time for anyone who missed out on the original, and despite the sticker shock, Analogue claims that the Noir is their best-selling console to date. In the nearly 4 years since the Nt Mini's original release, the classic gaming landscape has been flush with changes. Not only have Analogue themselves released several other consoles with better features at a significantly lower cost, but the open source Mr. FPGA console project has risen to become a central pillar of the preservation community. So, where does the Nt Mini Noir fit in? Well, after pre-orders had already closed, Analogue revealed that the Noir is hardly the same console that released in 2017, offering new abilities and feature parity with the Super NT and Mega SG. The big question is, how extensive are these changes? And does it still do everything that the previous version could? Let's find out.
From increasingly accurate software emulators to a variety of FPGA-based hardware emulation devices, the past half-decade has brought us so many new ways to enjoy the games of the past, and ways that continue to bring us closer and closer to perfectly recreate gameplay, visuals, and sound in the absence of original hardware. But of course, everyone has their own preferences and priorities, and it's important to respect that. It's not about arguing over whether playing games for free on your computer versus investing in games and hardware is smart or stupid. It's ridiculous to believe that everyone must play games in the same way, or to assume that you understand the reasons that someone else has to choose their method that's different from yours. Because ultimately, we're all here doing the same thing, enjoying classic games in our own ways. And of course, in this episode, we're looking at something that, in no small part due to its cost and exclusivity, falls squarely into the premium side of the gaming spectrum. And there's no beating around the bush here. At this point, you pretty much either have an Nt Mini Noir, or you don't. It was expensive, it sold out, and there won't be any more. So no one should be watching this video to decide whether they should go to Analogue's website and order one, because you can't. That ship has sailed, and frankly, it's extremely frustrating. But the units in this episode were provided to us by Analogue so that we could take an in-depth look at the system's functionality and give you our own independent analysis into how the Noir differs from the previous iteration. And of course, we'll also be showing how it compares to a variety of more readily available alternatives like the Retro USB AVS and the Mister. At a glance, the exterior of the console looks identical to its predecessor, complete with a full set of rear ports. Despite the Noir moniker, it's not so much black as it is more of a dark gunmetal gray, which we do rather like. The texture of the aluminum gives it a sheen that might make it look darker or lighter depending on where you've placed it. Some additional flourishes, such as the clear plastic used for the controller ports, are unexpected, but nice touches. As with the 2017 model, power is supplied from a barrel-style adapter rather than USB. One annoyance is that it seems to provide power to the controller ports even when the system is turned off, which causes any wireless receivers to blink constantly, searching for a controller. if it were possible to shut off the controller ports in standby mode via a firmware update, we sure would be happy about that. It is worth mentioning that the Noir ships with 8BitDo's newest wireless NES controller, the N30 2.4G version. We actually bought some of these ourselves when they were released earlier in 2020 and find them to be a marked improvement over the Bluetooth versions. Not only do they connect faster and have less lag than Bluetooth, but 8BitDo has come a long way when it comes to the quality of their D-pads. Some people still seem to take issue with them, but for me, the gold standard test is always Contra. And I have no trouble with holding diagonals or with accidentally triggering a press in a direction I didn't mean to, which definitely can be a problem on many alternative controllers. But of course, you can also use any other third-party or official Nintendo controller if you prefer. After all, the most obvious distinction between Analogue's consoles and something like the Mister is that, well, you can plug original controllers and original cartridges straight into it. For some people, that means nothing, but for others, it's hugely important. And for me, this was part of the most frustrating aspect of the 2017 NT Mini. On my unit, while the Famicom cartridge slot works just fine, the NES slot is, frankly, extremely unreliable. I had so much trouble that I cleaned my entire collection and it could still only read games about half the time. At least Analogue knew that this was a problem because one of their first marketing points on the Noir was that it sports a redesigned NES cart connector. Now, since NES carts are so tall and there's no camel hump like on the NES top loader, there is a lot of play in the fit around the slot, but it doesn't seem to have any negative impact on the system's ability to reliably read any reasonably clean NES carts. A huge improvement over the bad luck I had with the previous NES slot. What a relief! Luckily, the cart connector also releases games with minimal friction, much less than we've experienced with the Blinking Light Win or the AVS. Another minor but appreciated physical adjustment is that the power and USB ports have been nudged just the smallest amount to allow for a slightly more workable fit for the Famicom 3D system glasses. As usual, a full-sized SD card slot on the left-hand side of the console is used for firmware updates, color palettes, fonts, and whatever other types of files you might want to use to the console. Wink wink. More on that later in the video. I do personally prefer the much more compact, down-to-earth plastic shells of Analogue's newer designs, and I'd love to see them one day release an NES FPGA console that matches the Super NT, Mega SG, and Analogue Duo in looks and price. But for those who do enjoy the over-the-top weighty metal body as an art and conversation piece, this may very well be the last game console of its kind. But it's what's going on under the hood that really counts, and the Noir is not the same machine that was released in 2017. It is noticeably upgraded, driven by a more powerful FPGA, and it has the features to show for it, which, yeah, is definitely exciting, but it's also left some people feeling understandably unhappy. When the Noir was first announced, people asked us a lot if we thought it might offer interpolation or any of the other essential features that the Super NT and Mega SG have. Like everyone else, we had no real reason to believe that it would be anything more than what we already had. But then Analogue revealed in July, long after pre-orders were all sold out, that the feature set is much closer to the Super NT and Mega SG. So, yeah, while it is awesome that the features are here, a ton of people would have surely liked to have really known about all this before they decide to pass on securing a pre-order. Feels bad. There's just no other way to put it, and we really hope that Analogue can take steps to ensure that situations like this don't happen in the future. But whether you're lucky and do have your own NT Mini Noir, or you're just holding on to hope that Analogue might release some other kind of FPGA NES again in the future, let's dig in and see how things have changed. The 2017 NT Mini was an evolution of the high-def NES, and as such they feel broadly similar in the way their menus are presented. But with the release of the Super NT, a new paradigm was set in terms of features and overall ease of use. The Mega SG followed closely, and now so does the Noir. Browsing the system menu reveals many familiar options, and anyone who's become comfortable with recent analog systems will feel right at home here. The menu options let you tweak various color accents, fonts, and other assorted presentation flourishes. Hotkeys and controllers let you assign menu and reset shortcuts. The default menu combo is the familiar down and select, which is also mapped to the new N30 controller's home button, which I rather like. But if you change the hotkey setting from its default combo, the home button will stop working. You can also just disable all hotkeys if you're going to be playing a game where you find yourself bringing up the menu by mistake during gameplay. It's only a temporary setting. After you power down the system, you will of course be able to bring up the menu next time. You can also adjust various controller settings, such as for player setups and swapping, confirm, and cancel, which is crucial because, similar to the NT Mini, the default confirm button in the menu is B, which is completely backwards from the Nintendo standard. Like all analog consoles, you can also choose if you want the system to boot to the menu first, or just act like a real NES and boot directly to the game in the cartridge slot. And also, as with the 2017 model, you can tweak the front LED to behave in a variety of ways. So nothing really new here, but I do enjoy getting to choose my colors. The hardware menu has your region switches. Use USA if you're playing American or Japanese carts, PAL if you're playing officially released PAL carts, while Dindy matches the hardware of a Famicom clone that was popular in Russia. The fill RAM modes may help manipulate random number generators in some cases, but for behavior closest to original hardware, stick to the default random option. As for the voltage toggle, you should only need to use this if some reproduction cartridge seems to not behave correctly. According to Kevtris, the original NT Mini was actually 3.6 volts on the cartridge bus, so it's fine to operate original cartridges this way too, even though they run on 5 volts on the original console. But basically, if you're just playing original North American and Japanese carts, you should never need to use the hardware menu at all. Now, there is still a bit more to talk about regarding compatibility with various accessories, but since that relies in part on certain video features, let's go over that next.
Anyone who's been following Kevin Horton's work for a while now will know that his hardware designs are reliably solid. He's had a functioning NES FPGA core since 2004, elements of which inspired the high-def NES mod kit, and was later released in a more complete form in the NT Mini. It's safe to say that a portion of Analog's success can be directly linked to Kevin's talents, with his name becoming a selling point in and of itself. Look no further than the video settings, and sure enough, things will feel pretty familiar. Resolution options run the usual gamut, topping out at 1080p. Your basic screen size options offer several horizontal and vertical scaling settings with square pixels and 4.5x height being the default. This is a good base setting thanks in part to the Noir's most impressive and important upgrade, interpolation. Just to refresh your memory on how NES output has worked previously on these HDMI products, the high-def NES mod kit and the original hardware-based Analogue Nt can do 4x and 4.5x sizing at 1080p, but without interpolation. This means if you use a non-integer scale, you get uneven pixel sizing, which results in the dreaded scrolling shimmer. The only way to defeat the shimmer on those systems is to use integer scaling, such as 4x vertical and either 4x or 5x horizontal, which results in a picture that is either too skinny or a bit too fat. While the first version of the NT Mini did not offer interpolation, it is capable of a 5x vertical scale, which may cut off a small portion at the top and bottom of the image. Most games account for this in their screen layout, since it's similar to what you lose in the overscan area on the CRTs that these games were designed for. Pairing this with a 6x horizontal scale makes for an aspect ratio that, while not exactly 4:3, is extremely close and works well for most games. Starting with the Super NT, using a more powerful FPGA, Kevtris could develop a new scaling engine with superb interpolation, which slightly blurs the uneven pixels, and at last can be used with the NES and Famicom games on the NT Mini Noir, While 5x vertical and 6x horizontal are still fine options, now the image can be scaled however you prefer with no need to worry about shimmer. Power users will want to enable advanced mode to get the most out of the Noir's video capabilities. And let's not kid ourselves, this is a $500 NES system. If you bought it, you can likely place yourself into that category. Width and height is where a lot of the real fun is, and you can scale as granularly as you like, or you can quickly jump between desirable sizing presets with the press of the start button. However, please note that the presets are very much incorrect on the firmware that the system shipped with, which has 4.3 marked at a value that nearly fills the screen. We know that semi-professional pixel peeper Firebrand X has handed Ketris the correct sizing values, so hopefully by the time you see this video, it's been resolved with firmware updates. Regardless, here are the settings that we settled on for a majority of the footage in this episode. If you're using interpolation, then these should also work well for anyone using 1080p output, as long as you aren't also using scanlines. While interpolation is new for the NT Mini Noir, it's a bit late to the party for NES games. Horizontal interpolation was added to the Retro USB AVS with little fanfare in a firmware update over a year ago. Keep in mind that the AVS is limited to 720p output, but take a look. It's pretty impressive for older and less powerful hardware, wouldn't you say? Likewise, the Mister also has several filter options, including various takes on horizontal interpolation, so you can settle on a look that meets your preference. The open source approach to Mister is a real boon to the platform, with key features and major tweaks appearing all the time. Even supporting higher resolutions like 1200p or 1440p if you have the appropriate screen for it. But of course, the Mister is a very different approach with a different appeal, and it can be a lot more complicated to get up and running with it. As of right now, the Mister doesn't quite give you the same level of control over the image sizing as you get with the analog products. The way you can manipulate the image in real time on the Noir lets you dial in your preferred sizing, no matter how ridiculous. Cropping is of course nothing new. I mean, pretty much every HDMI NES device offers this, and allows you to cut some of the visual junk that often appears near the edge of the screen, especially in games that use more advanced scrolling techniques like Kirby's Adventure and Mario 3. The Scalers menu was also available on Ketris's previous NES devices, which simply add the familiar smoothing filters, if you're into those. However, the toggles for disabling vertical and horizontal interpolation also live here. While we recommend always leaving horizontal interpolation enabled, because there's no way to get 4:3 without a non-integer scale, you may wish to disable vertical if you're using a 4x or 5x vertical height, which will give a slightly sharper image. But for general use, you'll still have a very sharp image with vertical interpolation left on. However, one situation where you'll definitely want to use a vertical integer scale is if you're using any of the features in the scanlines menu. For the scanline spacing to look even, you must use an integer scale. The interpolation cannot fix uneven scanlines. Hybrid scanlines are new to the Noir model and let you go a bit further by allowing you to set just how defined the scanlines are over brighter colors. You know, there was a time when we'd say that you could get the best results by setting your system to 720p. But there's enough options here that you can really dial in an excellent representation at 1080p. We'll circle back to analog output in a bit, as it's kind of its own beast to wrangle, and instead, we'll go directly to extra features. As is standard on these NES hardware emulators, you can increase the sprite limit to reduce how often you'll see flickery graphics. We're not aware of any downsides to using this feature, but leave it off if you need to represent the game's graphics as authentically as possible. You can also set your preferred color palette here. This functionality is the same as on the previous NT Mini. Firebrand X is always a safe bet, but he's made many revisions over the years. This one seems to be his composite direct palette, but if you go download palette files over the internet, you can simply load them from the SD card. You can find anything from color palettes derived from official Nintendo products like the NES Classic Edition, or ones based on composite hues you'd expect to see on an old Sony CRT. Remember that the original NES has no defined RGB color values, and while we all have our own opinions about how it should look, there's no truly wrong answer here. If you're looking for a recommendation, we find Firebrand X's smooth palette to be the best option. It's a culmination of all of his palette work, and is more up to date than the included Firebrand X palette. While we're on the subject, let's skip down to the color menu. Here you can choose to limit the RGB range if your TV doesn't work correctly with the default full range. If turning this on makes your black levels look washed out, then you probably want to leave it off. But if not, then it might be the correct setting for your equipment. You can also increase the gamma, which is mostly used for compensating video levels when using scan lines. The buffer modes are another new feature introduced to analog products starting with the Super NT. As you may know, to ensure the smoothest and most highly compatible HDMI output, these devices output at 60 Hz by default. But in order to match the game rendering and the output, some adjustments are needed, and you get to choose how the system does it. While zero delay is not the default on the Noir, it has generally been the default on Cartridge's previous implementations. This means that the game speed is very slightly downclocked from the 60.08 Hz to 60 Hz, so that every frame is ready when the HDMI sends the next. This results in the smoothest gameplay and lowest latency. But for those who can't accept the speed discrepancy, the other options are for them. Fully buffered adds variable lag between 0 and 1 frame, and drops periodic frames that may be more or less noticeable depending on the game. Single buffer is theoretically less lag than fully buffered, but it has very prominent screen tearing. These options are also important when it comes to compatibility with certain accessories, which we'll go into in a bit. Finally, it's time to go back to the analog output. After interpolation, the second largest evolution of the Noir from the original is the ability to output HDMI and analog video simultaneously. This is great news for those who want to play on a CRT while streaming and recording over HDMI. The key to unlocking this potential is the different buffer modes available. If you're only using analog output, then the NT Mini will always output lag-free video at the true NES speed of 60.08 Hz. However, if you want to use analog simultaneously with HDMI, zero delay is not compatible with this configuration. You must first choose either fully buffered or single buffer from the buffer mode. We'd recommend fully buffered. Due to the built-in analog connections, the analog DAC is obviously not required for analog output, but it's actually supported if you have some use for dual analog output. Like the DAC, the VGA-style connector does not actually provide a VGA signal. What you're getting is a true 240p 15 kHz video, just like a real NES console. For all intents and purposes, the analog output should be identical whether you're using the built-in port or the external DAC. The connector pinout is based on commonly available cables, which you can find at monoprice.com. We went over the different connections that you can use in our episode on the 2017 NT Mini, which includes composite, S-Video, component, and a 5BNC RGB cable. A number of settings have been added thanks to the advances made by the DAC. Different sync settings are needed depending on what type of monitor or TV you're aiming for. RGB and component look extremely similar to the results you get from Tim Worthington's NES RGB mod, which is great. After all, we suspect that if you're the kind of person who buys a $500 NES recreation, you're here for something better than composite video. But if you ever did feel like going for an era-appropriate look, weirdly enough, the 2017 NT Mini seems to actually have an advantage when it comes to composite video. While the signal appears to be a touch brighter than composite from a real NES, the 2017 model behaves similarly to authentic NES output, which is great for the earthy, lived-in vibe of games like Xanadu. The Noir might also seem similar at a glance, but the composite noise seems to move through the image more quickly, which feels neither as pleasing nor as accurate. Regardless, S-Video remains an excellent analog option for those whose CRT might not have component or RGB. Both composite and S-Video are unaffected by your choice of color palette. They use the same YUV colors that the NES generates natively, which gives us an interesting peek into what might have been if the NES had a native S-Video connection. Chroma filters and the 7.5 IRE black levels are composite and S-Video specific features, which have more to do with the way that digital video systems are designed to handle legacy content and how bright it is. While the 700 MV RGB level will lower the brightness if the signal is blown out when using an RGB cable. Perhaps most importantly, there's the de-jitter toggle under extra features. Both the NES and Super NES emit a short scan line every other frame at the top of the image, which could break compatibility or cause a sync drop when using an upscaler such as the OSSC. Even if you're using HDMI output, you might want to turn this setting on to clean up the top row of pixels. It should be noted that a Mister equipped with an I/O board is also capable of delivering simultaneous HDMI and analog output. You can even muddy up an RGB or component signal to look like composite if you wanna. Well, that's pretty much the gist of it as far as video options are concerned when it comes to playing NES and Famicom games. While it's been a bit of a pleasant surprise to see all these features integrated into the Noir, it's equally unsurprising because it's so similar to what's on offer with the Super NT and Mega SG. But the bottom line is, if you've got a Noir, you can easily enjoy some of the absolute best visuals possible with NES games on a modern display.
Back when we made our episode on the 2017 NT Mini, it was kind of an eye-opener to me in terms of how I'd been taking NES sound reproduction for granted. I mean, sure, systems like the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx are well known for having sound that's difficult to emulate well, but most people would probably take any emulated version of NES music and assume it's authentic enough. But there are challenges there too. When I put recordings from a real Famicom against the NT Mini, I knew some things were different, but I don't have the ear to zero in on why or the know-how to do anything about it. But in the time since, we've gained new tools and information that have allowed even someone as musically inept as myself to take better advantage of the audio adjustments in both the 2017 model as well as the more advanced capabilities in the NT Mini Noir. The big breakthrough comes from MD Fourier, an open source project by Artemio Urbina, which has finally made it possible to get scientific data on how video game console audio signatures vary between console revisions or how close an emulated version is to matching the real thing. Notably, contributors to the Mister project have taken results from MD Fourier to significantly improve audio accuracy in their cores, including the NES and Famicom core. So now in 2020, there's a much higher bar to clear. But before we get any deeper, I'd like to point out that there is absolutely nothing wrong with using the Noir's default audio settings if this segment seems overwhelming to you. It's not like it's way off or anything, and a few years ago, I'd have probably left it totally alone myself. But in part due to MD Fourier, there is a rising call for emulator authors to go that last mile for audio accuracy, so this extra scrutiny has become expected. Artemio himself came up with his own set of recommended audio adjustments that apply to the 2017 model based on the audio signature from his own front-loader NES. Keep in mind that at present, MD Fourier only gives us the tools to measure differences between the NES's 5 native sound channels, the 5 listed at the top. Various Famicom expansion audio channels are listed below and may or may not be accurately balanced in this shot. So then, what about the Noir? MD Fourier plots how 2 signals differ. The closer all plots are to a flat line at the center, the more similar they are. Compared to a front-loader NES, the default audio settings give us this. Triangle seems to be pretty good, but the others need to be brought down a bit. With this knowledge, we can go to the audio settings and then channel levels, where we can make educated guesses for adjustments on square 1, square 2, triangle, noise, and DPCM, which are all defaulted at 64, at least on firmware 1.0. After a few attempts, we came up with this, but don't be afraid to download MD Fourier and run your own analysis. It's actually kind of fun. Just be sure to have the system set for fully buffered so that it runs at the same speed as original hardware, which ensures that the timing and pitch will be a closer match. The settings we settled on give us this result when compared against the NES front loader. As you can see, it's really close, but there's a bit of a drop off toward the right. That means that the Noir is applying a low pass filter to mitigate some of the frequencies that might be considered subjectively less pleasing. If you go to advanced filter settings, you'll see that the sound channels we're dealing with currently actually don't have the low pass filter turned on by default, which means that what we saw on the graph is a secondary low pass filter that cuts off a bit earlier than what exists on a real NES. In other words, even though we're really close, we cannot get data on the Noir that exactly matches the NES within the margin of error. So it would seem that the goal with the Noir audio here is attenuating the highest frequencies for a subjective improvement rather than absolute accuracy. But what do you think? Let's put what we've dialed in to the test and listen to how an unmodified NES, a 2017 NT Mini, an NT Mini Noir, and the Mr. sound. Things get a lot more complicated when it comes to expansion audio, which has way more variables to consider. As you may know, the Famicom disk system and several other Famicom game carts have extra audio hardware inside that is processed within the cart and passed as analog audio through the cartridge pins to be mixed with the console's native sounds. To use this feature as intended, the Enable Cartridge Audio toggle must be turned on. With firmware 1.1, the default volume level for cart audio was changed to 45, and audio experts we've spoken with seem to agree that this is the sweet spot. So if you have the real cartridges for games like Akumajo Densetsu, the Japanese Castlevania 3, this means that you get to enjoy the cart's actual sound hardware, and it's glorious. It's pretty harmless to leave cartridge audio on unless you have a reason to turn it off. But what if you don't have the real cartridge? If loading a ROM that supports expansion audio from a flash cartridge like an EverDrive, instead of cartridge audio, go to expansion chips and select the appropriate one. Which does assume that you have some knowledge of what hardware is used by each game. So for example, you'll need to choose VRC6 for Akumajo Densetsu, VRC7 for Lagrange Point, and Sunsoft 5B for Gimmick. Even if you then go and save your settings, this is a one-time setting. These are always disabled upon boot up, so re-enable it the next time you play the game. And if all this sounds like a hassle, don't worry. Considering the size of the entire library, not all that many Famicom carts overall even have expansion audio. Also, if you're loading a ROM via the NT Mini Noir jailbreak that supports any of these chips, the correct chip will be selected automatically, and more on the jailbreak later. At any rate, what you will hear with the appropriate chip selected is a hardware emulation of the intended sound. And even if you are using a real cart, you still have the choice here to use the Noir's version by choosing the appropriate chip and leaving cartridge audio disabled. In fact, EverDrives also use their own FPGA in the cart to recreate expansion audio in a similar way. But please remember, we are not audio mixing experts, but you do have the power to adjust the balance of individual sound channels from various expansion chips when using emulated expansion audio. If you'd like to hear the Noir's replication, choose the appropriate expansion chip. Or if you'd prefer to use the EverDrive's FPGA audio, enable cartridge audio to hear that, just like with a real cart. Now, the EverDrive sounded a bit low there, didn't it? And that's not to disparage the EverDrive sound emulation, but it's just to point out that you may need to raise the volume level from the EverDrive menu. The default of 100% seems to not be as loud as a real cart, but it can go up to 200%. And your experience may be different with an N8 Pro. You might have noticed that we didn't compare against a real Famicom because, well, my Famicom is an AV Famicom, which is widely considered to mix in expansion audio at far too high of a volume. In which case, the settings we've got on the Noir here may actually match the intended expansion audio mix better than the 1993 Famicom revision. The last point I want to look at regarding expansion audio is the Famicom disk system, which even I could tell sounded way off the mark in the 2017 NT Mini. Listen to this comparison from the episode we did on that model. The NT Mini's smaller FPGA did not have enough room to add a low-pass filter that is necessary for replicating the warmer sound heard with an actual Famicom disk system. If you go back to advanced filter settings, you'll notice that FDS and a special Namco chip are the only ones with the filter applied by default. And unless you want to muffle other sound channels for any particular reason, you should probably leave it this way. At the moment, we're only interested in how it attenuates the emulated FDS channel. You have a good deal of control over how the filter works, but without MD Fourier to assist, I'm kind of shooting in the dark here. Firmware 1.1 moved the default cutoff from 3000 to 6000, so I'll have to assume that was an informed decision on Kevtris's part, and that's what we're using in the third clip on the following comparison. So it's clear that there have been challenges when it comes to mimicking FDS and possibly the N163, but for all intents and purposes, the Noir's audio is a triumph by our reckoning, especially when using the audio adjustments we showed earlier for the 5 native sound channels. However, community members who have really dedicated themselves to the nitty-gritty of game preservation have identified some anomalies that people like us will never notice. And we know that they have suggested to Kevtris some additional toggles and phase inversion adjustments that would help the Noir come closer to its stated goal of preserving the Famicom hardware. And it's also worth noting that certain EverDrive expansion audio sound channels may actually not be completely in phase either. So while we do have to acknowledge that at present the Noir may not be exactly reference quality enough for preservation in the academic sense, any differences in audio quality will likely go undetected by a large majority of users, including ourselves. And for those more concerned with the result than a one-to-one replication, the Noir gives audiophiles plenty of granular controls to adjust and mix sound channels to suit their own personal taste, not necessarily targeting an authentic sound signature, but perhaps something that they personally prefer to listen to. A few returning audio features that are really more just for fun or personal preference include the channel panning, which some people like to use to turn the NES's mono sound into a sort of custom stereo setting. And under audio toys is distortion, which maybe could be used for fun effects by musicians, but in the wrong hands it just sounds like your NES is a bit inebriated. Two more audio adjustments are hidden outside the audio menu and are under core options. Disable looped noise is a feature meant to mimic a flaw in very early Famicom systems, while the purpose of disable square reload is to fix playback for some NSF files that may have been built using older, less accurate emulators, but normally both of these features should be left alone. And speaking of NSF, that is indeed another welcome returning feature from the first NT Mini. It's tucked away under Tools all the way back at the top menu, alongside the cheat codes, which, is basically a Game Genie. NSF stands for Nintendo Sound Format, a format Kevtris actually made way back in the day himself, and plays raw Famicom sound data as a soundtrack if you download the appropriate files.
So there's improvements all around. Graphics, sound, and even a few esoteric hardware behavior tweaks are all possible with the NT Mini Noir. But the question remains, with so much change from the previous model, does it still deliver on what people buying it expected it to do? As Tri already mentioned, the Famicom 3D system now connects much more easily, but since the timing of the shutter relies on a CRT display, don't expect for the effect to work very well if running 3D capable games out via HDMI. To be honest, this is the only accessory that either of us have for the Famicom expansion port, but we suspect virtually everything should work. Similar to the 3D glasses, the NES Zapper does work, but as usual, it's meant to be used with analog output. Anything from composite on up to RGB will work just fine. One tricky accessory is the Famicom disk system. For the uninitiated, the black thing that connects to the cartridge slot is called the RAM adapter, while the big red box is more or less just a disk reader that sends data to the RAM adapter. If loading games from Loopy's FDS stick, the RAM adapter is actually the only part of the system that is needed. This is a very reliable method for getting FDS games to work correctly. Something that Keptress recently informed us of is apparently some RAM adapters had trouble with the first NT Mini. As far as we know, this is no longer a problem on the Noir. But there is a quirk. Because of the nature of how the hardware works, you cannot use a Famicom Disk System RAM adapter in zero delay mode, and must choose another buffer mode, preferably fully buffered. This allows for the Noir and the disk system to work together in harmony, and is similar to how analog output must adhere to the original 60.08 Hz video timing when using analog video. Similarly, there may be issues with some EverDrives, particularly if their firmware is not up to date. For instance, we tried playing Red Racer on an N8 with older firmware and spotted glitches in the sky, but this was cleared up with the latest firmware from Crix. In general, you should expect the EverDrive N8 and the N8 Pro to work without issue. Likewise with the Retro USB Power Pack. Of course, using flashcards is all well and good if you've already got them, but as we've hinted at a few times in the video already, the NT Mini Noir does not disappoint with this jailbreak firmware. You can read instructions and download the latest versions of the jailbreak from the Smoke Monster Pack's GitHub. Just like installing the official firmware, you simply drop it in the root of your SD card, pop it in the system, and let the system do its thing until the LED finishes blinking. There's no downside to using the jailbreak firmware, and all normal features will behave the same as usual. As with the previous model, the jailbreak allows you to load NES and Famicom ROMs directly from the SD card. No flash cart required. But before loading your games onto your card, be sure to carefully read the instructions on the GitHub and format your card in FAT32. If your card is larger than 32 gigabytes, I personally like to use the free mini tool partition wizard to allocate my space properly. The blog Nerdly Pleasures has a great post comparing the mapper compatibility matrices of the Noir, the previous NT Mini, the Mister, and various flashcards, revealing that the jailbroken Noir may overall be the most highly compatible ROM loading hardware for the NES and Famicom to date. Keep in mind that there are some mappers that may be supported by the EverDrive N8 Pro and not the Noir, and vice versa, but most incompatibilities revolve around hardware used in homebrew or pirate games, not officially released software. Even still, you're likely to find that most homebrew and pirate ROMs should work. And beginning with the second jailbreak firmware update, Famicom Disk System games also load natively. They just have to conform to the allowed byte sizes listed in the jailbreak README. Depending on how you got them, some ROMs may be padded with 16-byte headers, which can be removed easily with a hex editor. When a Disk System game is running, you'll discover a new feature under core settings called FDS. This allows you to set how disk swapping works. The default is to hold select when prompted to switch sides. But of course, there's so much more to the jailbreak than simply offering a convenient way to play NES games without carts. One of the big reasons that the previous NT Mini became so sought after was because unlike the Super NT and Mega SG jailbreaks, this jailbreak added many of the 8-bit FPGA cores that Keptress had made for his own learning and amusement over the years. In the time before the Mister took off, this was a really big deal. And even today, it offers hardware emulation for some platforms that the Mister still does not. There are 20 extra game platforms and several additional fun tools included with the NT Mini Noir jailbreak. This includes major 8-bit platforms like the Atari systems, ColecoVision, Game Boy Color, and Game Gear, along with a smattering of obscure, who cares kind of stuff like the Video Brain and Game King. But that's what makes it all so interesting. It's stuff that you'd otherwise probably never dabble in, and it's awesome to see that it's here in hardware emulated form. New to the Noir jailbreak are Intellivision, Megaduck, and perhaps most surprisingly, the Sega Genesis. At a glance, this seems to work just like the Mega SG's implementation. Genesis games are actually quite playable with an NES controller. C is mapped to select, which may be bad in a lot of cases. But since Genesis games tend to let you remap your controls, it works surprisingly well. Notably, the Noir jailbreak features over 10 platforms that are still not yet supported in Mister: Intellivision, Arcadia 2001, Creativision, Game King, RCA Studio 2, Atari 7800, Adventure Vision, Channel F, Game8, Supervision, and MegaDuck. After launching any core, pressing the menu hotkey will bring up the file browser so you can go through your ROMs that you've installed on the card. Pressing start will then allow you to access the settings, which are saved on a per core basis. So if you want to use different scalar settings for the Master System and Game Boy than NES, and you should, then you don't have to worry about it affecting your NES core settings. The biggest advantage here over the 2017 NT Mini is that interpolation is now available on all cores while outputting HDMI, allowing for free scaling and more precise aspect ratio with no shimmer. Do keep in mind that some cores are more polished than others. A few of them definitely need more work if they're ever to be a prime feature on a future device. As of right now, the HDMI scaling engine is not particularly well implemented in some cores, which can make it very difficult or even impossible to get ideal sizing and centering. Keep an eye on Firebrand X's YouTube channel for content dealing with how to get the best scaled image and appropriate aspect ratio for various jailbreak cores. We can't get into all these settings on a per core basis, but options do vary by core and include very specific stuff like enabling CRAM DOS on the Genesis, to toggling FM synth on the Master System, and other audio adjustments. When using analog output, composite video characteristics vary by core. For example, Genesis has plenty of rainbow artifacts, but much like the analog DAC with the Mega SG, the character of composite doesn't perfectly match a real Genesis regardless of the chroma filter chosen, and dither blending doesn't quite work like many might hope. Regardless, it's funny to think about how even composite video is an upgrade for many of these consoles, since the original hardware for pre-NES consoles tend to be RF only. Naturally, S-Video, RGB, and component for any core all look as excellent as you'd hope. As usual, many platforms do require BIOS files to run. Check the text in the BIOS folder to learn which ones are needed and what to name them. You can change BIOS files per core if needed through the Core Options menu. If you really want to take full advantage of some cores, you may need to use a different sort of controller, such as a simple SNES to NES controller adapter, which can even be built by hand. For example, Atari 2600 toggle switches can be worked more easily from the controller rather than through the Core Options menu. And the ColecoVision's number pad can be used through various SNES button combos as needed, or even the NTT data pad if you have one. The Intellivision actually requires this controller for full input functionality. A random core that is not exactly a game platform is Kepcher's Mandelbrot viewer, which he wanted to include in the first NT Mini, but it wasn't powerful enough. Basically, it lets you zoom in infinitely on a visualized Mandelbrot set. Not exactly useful, but definitely an interesting bit of nerdy fun. When using the jailbreak, you'll find the NSF player in the cores list, in addition to an SPC player. That's for Super Nintendo music files. Back under Tools, in the NSF player's place, is CopyNES Mini. This FPGA version of Kepcher's own groundbreaking NES dumper hardware was also available in the 2017 jailbreak. This lets you create your own ROM dumps from your own NES carts, with the only caveat being that you need to know what kind of mapper hardware it's using to get a good dump. You can also check the box for whether the game supports saves, which will let you dump your save data as well. Hey, many NES save batteries still do work. This could be your chance to back up your childhood saves. The only catch here is that you can't actually write your save file back to the cartridge. This is a feature that is actually possible with the Retro USB AVS's scoreboard application, although it doesn't always work that reliably. While making your own dumps of ROMs that are readily available may not seem very interesting to most people, we've heard that the ROM dumper included with the Super NT jailbreak made for a situation where previously undocumented ROMs and game revisions were discovered at a rate not seen since the 90s. So if you happen to have any carts laying around in your collection that you feel are weird or unusual for any reason, maybe it's a prototype, pirated game, and so forth, then think of it like this. The CopyNES Mini gives you an easy opportunity to contribute to the cause of game preservation.
The NT Mini Noir is a device that is equally as surprising as it is unsurprising. We went from assuming it would be no different from what we had in 2017 to wondering if the totally revamped firmware precluded it from having the same unadvertised multi-console potential that made the original so sought after, and then being surprised all over again when the jailbreak offered everything it had and more. And yet the advancements are largely predictable. I really do hope that this is not the last time we see Analogue release a Famicom system. I've said before and I'll say it again. I'd prefer something much more affordable that fits in better with their plastic systems. And it would truly seem like a wasted effort if all these features live and die on a system that no one really expected to be upgraded like it is. The Noir most certainly is not completely perfect and still needs some patches if it is to achieve its advertised goal of true reference quality, but in most regards it should be clear that it is extremely close. And even in a scene where Mr. continues to gain steam, it offers its own set of features and unique perks and stands tall alongside the likes of the AVS and of course original hardware mods as one of the best ways to experience the NES and Famicom with real cartridges and real accessories.